Uh, Thank you everyone for joining us this morning for the launch of Pharmacy Forecast Australia 2021. Before we get started, I'd first of all like to acknowledge the country and welcome to country. So in the, Julia, is there a slide to come up? No? So in the spirit of reconciliation, SHPA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So, like I said, thank you for joining us today for the launch of Pharmacy Forecast Australia. This is a rather exciting day because it's the Forecast's inaugural year, and we're all very excited to share with you the journey that we've been on, the robust process and the analysis that's culminated in this landmark report for 2021. What we'll be doing this morning is hearing 5-minute snapshots on each of the 6 themes from each of our 6 advisory committee members, including Committee Chair Russell Levy. Before we then open up to questions, so make sure that you note down your questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll address them later on, but hopefully we can all, at the end of this, turn all of our microphones and cameras back on and ask questions verbally. So yes, please note down any questions you may have as we progress through. And finally, at the end, we'll hear from SHPA CEO Kristen Michaels, who will wrap up for the day. But first, it gives me a great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to Matt Hill, who's General Manager Asia Pacific, on behalf of our supporting partner organisation, Omnicell, who've made this initiative possible. So I'll hand over to Matt now to say a few words about that partnership. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Tom, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Matt Hill from Omnicell. I've got 2 slides and a few brief insights to share with you all today. So firstly, Omnicell's really delighted to be involved as the exclusive partner of the SHPA Pharmacy Forecast Australia. Over in the United States, the company's been associated with ASHP Pharmacy Forecast for the past several years. So I think it's more than high time that we have our own independent research work here in Australia. And so thank you and well done to Russell, Kristen, Sally, Laura, Tom, and the rest of the Pharmacy Forecast Advisory Committee and the Omnicell team for your drive and hard work to make this happen. The concept of research and collaboration, getting together with customers and associations, discussing matters of importance to pharmacy and to healthcare, is at the very heart of Omnicell. As a company, we've shown through time that we relish working closely with our customers and tackling important challenges together, sustaining a culture of clinically founded innovation. More locally, over the past 12 years in Australia, together with our long-term business partner, Andrew Finster, and his team from Meditech Pharmacy Automation, we work with a really amazing roster of customers, all seeking to evolve pharmacy and healthcare practice. Some of the elements we strive collectively for include 0 medication errors, 0 medication waste, 100% data and inventory visibility, 100% regulatory compliance, 100% pharmacist time focused on clinical activities. Globally, our company, Omnicell, has framed these elements as the journey to the autonomous pharmacy, and it's become a transformative vision for the company. So, on to COVID. There is little doubt that the past 16 months has challenged us all. Challenges still remain, and as of today, many of you on the call, in fact, I think around 20 million Australians are currently in some form of COVID lockdown. For a change, in Melbourne, currently where I'm sitting, we're open for business, although I do say currently. And I guess with the philosophy of using a crisis as an opportunity to do things differently, Omnicell has responded in a number of ways. Next slide, please. Firstly, we've really increased the amount of virtual training meetings and virtual sessions that we are having. And in the shot there, you can see a photo of Andrew Finster and Sam from Omnicell giving a customer training session from our Melbourne Customer Experience Centre. Additionally, We've created rapid manufacturing and turnaround for hospital customer equipment. We've developed a suite of remote diagnostic technologies. And we've really deepened our big data analysis capability as a step to identifying important trends to do with COVID. And lastly, we've really improved our infection control methodologies. And I'm sure that this work based on customer collaboration will continue. So, and a tip, as I finish up here, a tip, please remember to keep your vendors engaged and informed together with you through these challenges. I'm sure that they'll be looking to help more. And if they're anything like Omnicell, they will be keen to do more. So back to the forecast. I'm really excited, as I said before, to be at today's launch. I'm interested to learn more about what research data and collective wisdom is telling us currently. What are the challenges and what do we as health professionals need to do further to innovate? And I promise that Omnicell will remain engaged in the process, committed to innovating and being there with you. So with that, I thank you and I leave you to the rest of the meeting. So thanks, back to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce the person who has led us through this process and has really been a driving force and the brains behind adapting pharmacy forecast here in Australia. So I'd like to introduce one of the great gentlemen of hospital pharmacy in Australia, the chair of the Pharmacy Forecast Australia Advisory Committee, Russell Levy, to get us underway today.
Thanks, Tom, for that very kind introduction. I thought just to set the scene, I'd like to talk to you about the process that's taken us to the point where we're at today, where we're presenting the Pharmacy Forecast Australia. So the impetus really arose for doing the Pharmacy Forecast Australia from SHPA delegation who attended the 2019 mid-year ASHP meeting in December. And I was one of those delegates. So at that time, I didn't know about the Pharmacy Forecast, but I attended a session there along with several other delegates. Not realizing it was already 8 years old at that time and become quite an institution, something that was looked forward to by our American colleagues. So I was really blown away by the pharmacy forecast that ASHP put together. I thought, what a fantastic initiative. And upon return to Australia, I spoke to SHPA about that too. And as it turns out, they were thinking similar things and they had that in their minds that that's something they'd like to progress. So really, the Pharmacy Forecast Australia, we've depended a lot on our colleagues in partnership with ASHP and really thank them for their efforts and help. They've been very generous in their support with their methodology and their experience. It gave us a big head start for doing one in Australia. So in particular, David Chen and Barbara Nussbaum, I'd really like to thank, and Sally Richards also from SHPA, along with the advisory committee. So what we did was the first step was to form our own Pharmacy Forecast Advisory Committee. And you'll be hearing from each of those members today. Once we've done that, we went about conducting an environmental scan to figure out what the issues and concerns were at that time that would be influencing the health system pharmacy over the next 5 years. And to do that as part of the environmental scan, we used insights from SHPA's policy and advocacy activities, as well as contributing to that list of issues that we were aware of in our own practice. The next step for the committee was to analyse and through an iterative workshop, we expanded and refined the topics that had been identified through the environmental scan. When we were doing that, we were organising them kind of organically into different themes which emerged, which was great. So there were, as it turned out, there were 6 themes that emerged from that iterative workshop that we conducted. And then the advisory committee identified theme leads who would be subject matter experts in those 6 areas to ask them, invite them to be part of the process of writing up the survey and generating the questions. Question generation was the next step. So to do this, the Forecast Advisory Committee members worked with their assigned theme leads for those 6 different themes. And the task was to generate 6 questions for each of those themes. So in the end, we had 36 questions, as you'll see in the forecast in total. And the final stage for the generation of the forecast was to, of course, send out the questions to the forecast panelists. So the questions are all structured in the same way. They're very concrete in their questioning. So they're all things along the lines of the likelihood of something happening in the next 5 years.
So, thank you, Russell. Hopefully everyone can see what an exciting opportunity this is to really gain an understanding as to what's coming for us over the next few years in hospital pharmacy in Australia. I'd also like to just acknowledge that we have a number of people from ASHP joining us today for the launch. Doug Scheckelhoff, David Chen and Eric Moroika, I think have joined us for our launch this morning, well, this morning our time. So thank you very much for your generosity in sharing the forecast process and methodology with us and for partnering with us on delivering this in Australia. In a moment, we'll hear more from Russell because he was also the theme lead from theme number 2. And so our next step is to meet the members of the advisory committee and hear from them about their themes. So along with myself and Russell, who are on the committee, I'd just like to acknowledge in the room we have Ange Young, Peter Smart, Andrew McLaughlin and Howard Vautran, who are all theme leads. And we'll now be going through each of our themes. It's been, I guess I just want to say before that it's been really lovely to work with an assembled A-team of people from across the country and to then be able to, I guess, put a bit of a dipstick out there to the country to get a sample of representative views from pharmacy leaders' perceptions on what's important in pharmacy practice as it approaches us. And I was very enthusiastic to be involved in this theme, which is the workforce of the future section. So I'll next slide, please, Laura. Within each theme, as well as the chairs for this group, Margie Button-Norris and Sharon Goldsworthy from Queensland and South Australia were also deeply involved in putting together the theme questions and assessing the results we got back. So as I say, the theme that I was responsible for was the workforce of the future, and we wanted to ask a number of things in relation to what will the workforce look like in 2026, and that was around what kind of roles and scope of practice they'll have, and we chose collaborative prescribing as the example role that we perceived being of relevance to understanding people's views for 2026. We also wanted to understand people's perspectives on the leadership component of the pharmacy workforce. What proportion of pharmacy leaders will have received not just training in pharmacy, but training, mentoring and competency assessment in leadership as pharmacy leaders. And we also wanted to pick apart the impact of residency, which has obviously been relatively new, I think launched 4 years ago now. And to people's perspectives on SHPA Foundation residency by 2026. So as you can see here, the results from the first question that we asked were that demonstrates that there's probably somewhat ambivalent, but somewhat optimistic that collaborative prescribing will be a standard model of care nationally. And of course, we used the terminology collaborative prescribing rather than partnered charting, which many of you will have just heard about in the Directors of Pharmacy Forum. because collaborative prescribing covers, I guess, a broad church of practices. So although somewhat evenly mixed, I'd say much more towards the optimistic than the pessimistic. That will be something that is practiced as a standard model of care across the regions and hospitals that people are practicing in. A second question there around leadership positions. I would say that's a very kind of hopeful and optimistic response that the leadership workforce of 2026, if you add those numbers up, it's two-thirds or over two-thirds of all pharmacy leaders will not just have been trained in leadership, but will have received competency assessment. And I guess to me, that was an interesting response then to pick apart in terms of, well, what leadership resources are available to support people on those development journeys. And I know that the Leadership Management and Leadership Group has been very active in trying to understand what opportunities there are and what barriers there are. The third question you can see on the screen is around SHPA residency. I guess seeing as one of the sites that's been one of the lead sites, or one of the early sites, I should say, the early adopter sites for residency. I see residency as being very important for the future of hospital pharmacy. And so I guess it was seeing these somewhat mixed results for residency suggests that perhaps there's more work that people need to do to understand the ease of adoption of residency into their workplaces, as well as the significant benefits to the workplace and to the profession, and of course to the resident. I can move to the next slide, please, Laura. So our next three questions continued on, looking at residency, looking at the advanced training residencies that are now available. Obviously, these are still extremely new, and so perhaps not surprising that people still aren't seeing that as making up a huge proportion of the workforce. Again, as one of the early adopter sites that's involved in the advanced training residencies, I see these as being hugely important for our future, and part of the write-up that you'll see of these in the pharmacy forecast document when you get the chance to read it, is the notion that this for us as a profession represents a huge step forward in the maturation of our approach to what we've previously called specialist pharmacists, but recognising that in order to be a specialist, you actually need to have been assessed as a specialist if we want true specialisation within hospital pharmacy. So it'll be very interesting to see those results in the future, because I'm sure they'll be taking off. Question 5 was also of interest to me. So we asked about the availability of the workforce in the future, and we asked a multidimensional question here. Will there be a surplus of appropriately skilled candidates? And so this question is going to bring together those two dimensions, which means you kind of need to consider that when picking it apart. I guess I was interested in the optimism of our forecast panelists, that there seems significant optimism that there will be, when you advertise a job in 2026, you will be getting a surplus of candidates who have appropriate skills for the role. And as you'll see in the write-up in the forecast document when you receive it, I guess my own perspective is I see some challenges along the way to achieving that, because whilst we've got more graduates than we've ever had, and we've got growth in the workforce, we also probably have record low levels of morale out there in outside of the hospital setting. And many of you will have seen the report demonstrating significant low levels of morale in the community sector. And I guess it's interesting to pick apart what impact that will have on entrance to the pharmacy profession. Will people still be enrolling in a pharmacy degree in 5 years' time with the enthusiasm that they have been over the last 20, given that the majority of people who hold a BPharm are now practicing in an area that has lower morale. Hospital morale, obviously significantly higher, but you've got to get people to be pharmacists first. So the final question that I'll talk to is about our technician workforce. And what we sought to understand was whether the pharmacy technicians of Australia by 2026 would be likely to have the appropriate qualification or recognised certification. And as you can see, the vast majority of responses there were positive. I think that was the most positive response across our theme. And I guess that makes sense, given that it's generally a prerequisite for pharmacy technician jobs. However, as you'll see, we've got some discussion of this in the forecast document around the fact that whether those qualifications remain current and relevant, the Cert 3s and 4s that are offered in Australia, whether there's further adaptation that needs to take place to support that is another question. And I guess bringing together question 2 and question 6 around the need to support leadership development for our technicians rather than just technical skills development. So that leads in finally to the recommendations that, that our group came up with for the Workforce of the Future theme. And these are our recommendations to the pharmacy profession broadly and to the pharmacy leaders who are in the room today. Understanding that collaborative prescribing has been a recommendation and has been a finding of the Pharmacy Board of Australia, has been within our scope of practice now for several years. What do we need to do to move forward to 2026? And as we've heard from Duncan and the Directors of Pharmacy Forum, those of us who attended earlier, the barriers aren't regulatory anymore, they are practice-based barriers. So the challenge is for every pharmacy leader in Australia to understand how that can be, how those barriers in their local environments can be addressed. Around leadership competency, we want to ensure that our leaders are supporting the education and training of the next generation of leaders. And that includes the advanced training residency that's in leadership that's now being provided at one site, but we hope to see being spread more broadly. In terms of pharmacy residencies, given their huge strategic importance to us as a profession as we mature, we want to see that leaders nationally are undertaking gap analysis as to what the gap is to implementing pharmacy residencies more broadly. And finally, supporting skilled workforce through promotion of hospital pharmacy as a career, as I was alluding to, given that the workforce outside of the hospital walls is perhaps at a tipping point. If we want to ensure that we have the vacancies, that we have the people available to fill vacancies in 2026 and beyond, we want to make sure that hospital pharmacy is seen as a career that people want to enrol in, perhaps at high school, when they leave high school and enrolling in a degree, that they see hospital pharmacy as a career. And many of the pharmacy leaders in the room can play a role in that. We all have relationships with high schools, universities and things to do open days and really drive hospital pharmacy as a career choice for the future. And finally, to support the investment in hospital pharmacy technicians, ongoing CPD, not just the mandatory certificate 3s and 4s, but the other training required as that area of practice specialises and advances to support the entire profession practicing at the top of its scope of practice. So I think that's all the slides that I have to speak to. I'll now hand over once again to Russell Levy, who is going to take us through theme 2. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Theme 2, I would like to thank our theme leads, subject matter experts Sue Cursor and Anna McClure, for their assistance in preparing and analysing the results from this one. Theme 2 is titled Workforce Access and Resourcing. It's a bit analogous to Tom's theme, but looking more specifically what we have available at hand now. So it's looking at things that rethinking the way we provide services to match them to increasing demands and providing extra support for inpatient and outpatient care as well, which may be changing as well. So it seeks to harness the efficiencies from new technology, remodeling existing structures and seeking more workforce investment to meet national and state priorities in healthcare, which they're the topics that are addressed in the questions. So if we go to the next slide, please, Laura. Look at some of the results. So the first two questions are kind of related to each other. They're more to do with resourcing specialised services. So the first one's about 50% of hospitals having services in the ambulatory care settings where they haven't had previously for high-risk clinics or even in the community. And also question 2, looking at integration of pharmacists more into multidisciplinary teams as part of stewardship roles, which are emerging, or if not already embedded. So those two questions are around resourcing specialised services. And as you can see from the results, the forecast panelists are sceptical that resources will be provided for expanded services. And that's despite multiple government initiatives prioritising the movement of patients in the direction of ambulatory care settings and hospital avoidance strategies such as treatment and care at home. So significant advocacy is going to be required to ensure pharmacy can deliver the required services and be a resource to do that in line with the advances in patient care standards, which will be expected in new versions of the national standards, for example. Question 3 looks at the clinical pharmacy workforce being utilising electronic platforms more effectively, such as My Health Record in their clinical practice. So there's a firm belief that the promise of operational efficiencies will be realised with continued advancement of and improvements to digital records, such as My Health Record, and also its integration to local systems. The necessity to have pharmacy informatics available should really be a priority to facilitate those changes, because without that, it's very hard to integrate these new services or new platforms effectively. If you go to the next slide, please, Laura. Okay, so question 4, at least 50% of hospitals will have a 7-day pharmacy service matched to patient needs and specialties. So the forecast panelists, as you can see, were quite ambivalent to the suggestion that the advances required to deliver some of those new initiatives and expanded services discussed in the earlier questions, and also for a 7-day service that they'd be possible to achieve that in the next 5 years. So there remains significant cultural and industrial obstacles which need to be addressed, and significant advocacy and energy will need to be expended by leadership to achieve that. Question 5 relates to the development of new hospital sites or redevelopments of existing ones, sometimes known as greenfield sites for a whole new hospital when it's built, and whether pharmacy automation will be included in the design of those facilities. So there's wide agreement, as you can see, that these sites and redevelopments will consider and include automation in their design. So it's really important that pharmacy leaders need to be across the specifications for those tools, robotics and ADCs, etc., and the associated workforce impacts that they will bring with them in order to ensure that the leaders need to be sure that they're going to be at the table when planning for new facilities is occurring as well, to make sure that those needs can be addressed. And the last question also relates to technicians, but from a bit of a different perspective, I suppose. So the question of the likelihood of pharmacy technician workforce having the legal and professional responsibilities necessary to enable them to undertake activities currently assigned to pharmacists. So as you can see from this one, there was a majority disagreement that the pharmacy technician scope of practice expansion will be realised in the next 5 years. And I guess that reflects the slow pace of change, despite significant expenditure and effort by organisations such as SHPA and other sectors of the profession as well to achieve it. The ability to maintain momentum for change for what's a relatively small workforce and gain the necessary industrial and legal changes for technicians remains a challenge, and that's reflected in the responses, I think, there. Our pharmacy technicians do, however, remain largely an untapped resource, and continued lobbying will need to be required from all levels of pharmacy to progress that change further. Next slide, please, Laura. Okay, so there were 5 recommendations that arose from this theme as well. So they are to do with resourcing and advocating for specialised clinical services 7 days a week. So this needs to align with operational needs and peak demand. So, so you've got the right people on site at the right time. The second one, advocate for increased pharmacy informatics roles that harness smart technology to inform safe systems. So as mentioned, we're really to embed an informatics role in the integration of electronic processes to try and make sure that there's a realistic and useful human interface with those systems that are developed. Third one, integrating electronic health records into business as usual practice. In doing so, we'll harness the efficiencies promised by these developments. A fourth recommendation is about considering pharmacy design and models of care that incorporate automated technologies in faculty and service planning. So that's been discussed, and that's something that we need to ensure that we're at the table with for all those discussions for redevelopment sites. And the final one about the technicians advocating for expanded pharmacy technician roles at all levels. So this needs to continue and need to be championed by our pharmacy leaders, engaging unions, health agencies, local facility executives, etc., to get that change across the line. Thanks, Tom. That's over to you again.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Russell. So now we move on to the next theme, which was led by Ange Young. Over to you, Ange.
Thanks, Tom. I'm really excited to present theme 3, which is reliability of medicine supply. I'd like to acknowledge our leads and authors. Firstly, our technician representative, Laura Hickman, as well as pharmacists Noman Masood and Duncan McKenzie. I think prior to COVID, if we'd mentioned supply as a theme, I think there would have been much less importance placed on the topic. However, thanks to COVID, medicine supply has been placed under the spotlight. And I think this has been reflected by the panelists' responses that show they believe more change is likely to occur in this space in the next 5 years. Next. In question 1, we can see some uncertainty, but a level of optimism about there being a national system that will provide early warning or notification about all potential disruptions? This question was included, I think, because it recognises that the existing systems are fairly inadequate at forecasting and managing all supply disruptions currently. In question 2, we also see a general level of optimism for regulatory and policy changes occurring in the next 5 years that will ensure all hospitals, irrespective of location or size, have equitable access to medicines. This is despite SHPA's survey of hospital pharmacy directors last year, which showed disparate access to medicines during COVID, with rural and remote hospitals experiencing more frequent back orders and less confidence in sourcing medicines for their ICUs than their metropolitan counterparts. In question 3, forecast panelists were fairly split, expressing uncertainty about the federal government mandating an essential and relevant never out list and providing a system that would encourage manufacturer or wholesalers to maintain adequate supply of these medicines. This may be due to the awareness that creating a one-size-fits-all essential medicines list has proven to be challenging across the globe, and there appears to be no policy initiative that requires suppliers to hold greater supply of their products in Australia, despite there being systems in place in other countries such as France. Next. Question 4, we can see a near even split from panelists about whether there's likely to be a minimum set of standards or credentialing process to measure pharmacy procurement system performance in all pharmacy departments. And in question 5, this is the initiative the panelists thought was the least likely to occur in this theme. Around 70% thought it was unlikely that national standards for FTE in procurement will be set in the coming 5 years. And finally, in question 6, over half of the forecast panelists felt it was unlikely that automation and robotics would be built into most distribution systems in the next 5 years, probably recognising that there are some challenges for some health services, whether that being perhaps a lack of economies of scale for smaller or more remote hospitals, or perhaps a lack of organisational inertia to creatively implement new technology, as well as the changes that can occur to workflows and to the roles of individuals in the broad medication supply system. Next. So 3 main themes of recommendations. So supporting advocacy for improved centralised early warning systems for medication shortages. This should be done at a federal level and may be supplementary to the advocacy already provided from other groups such as Medicines Australia and the Medicines Shortages Working Party. However, across jurisdictions, the authors recommended that there should also be support for the national linking and collaboration between jurisdictions who already have some effective warning systems in place. And within jurisdictions, pharmacy leaders should coordinate collaboration and cooperation to share stock holding information and essential medicines lists. The second theme around developing and advocating a purchasing standards policy. The authors recommended that the sector needs to promote overarching ethical principles of beneficence, solidarity, utility, equity, and stewardship that highlights the role of the TGA's Medicines Shortages Information System as a notification system for initiating resource allocation responses and implementing shortage in management plans, rather than as being just a simple signal for predatory buying. Finally, uniting behind robust pharmacy procurement standards. Through collaboration of hospital pharmacy leaders in this area, it was suggested that we could create a standard of practice that recognises pharmacy procurement as an essential component of hospital pharmacy operations, which includes system performance measures, FTE recommendations, and credentialing guidelines. Pharmacy leaders could also ensure that existing distribution systems are optimised and engage in planning and evaluation of whether automation or robotics would be effective and useful within their service. Finally, we also suggested that the recommendations from the SHPA COVID-19 Hospital Pharmacy Capacity Snapshot final series report be implemented and also followed through. I'd now like to pass over to Peter Smart for theme 4.
Thanks, Ange. So theme 4, focusing on the changing landscape of medication complexity and access. It's important to distinguish between the supply issues that Ange has just examined in her group and what we labelled as access. We assumed the supply chain wasn't compromised, but rather we explored issues with affordability at both the patient and system level, administrative barriers and burdens, and convenience for patient collection. The complexity component, I suspect, is fairly easy for most of us to understand. These tend to be the things that keep drugs and therapeutics committees around the country on their toes. Think CAR T-cell therapy, blinatumomab, GMOs, personalised medicines, and access programs in all their various and ingenious forms. Our theme leads were highly credentialed in this space. Barry Jenkins, Chief Pharmacist at Fiona Stanley Hospital in Perth, and Tom Chinoweth, whose role I will abbreviate in the interest of time, to Deputy Director of Pharmacy at Monash Health in Melbourne. Both work at the forefront in this space and have provided a wealth of insights as part of the forecasting exercise. Next. So to the questions asked of the panellists and the results, the first 2 questions looked at specialised resources for pharmaceutical procurement and management of medicines access programs. It was clear that most panellists acknowledged the role that pharmacists with a comprehensive clinical skill set will play in both these areas moving forward. It seems there's agreement that the growing number of access programs or specialised supply arrangements require resourcing not dissimilar to those required to manage clinical trials. Access and funding are inseparable notions in many ways. So the next question, question 3, is an obvious one to ask. Perhaps a little surprisingly, given the current landscape and the not insignificant barriers that would need to be overcome, panellists remained optimistic that reforms to medicine funding that improve access would be enabled by 2026. Next. It would appear biosimilars will become well established within hospitals and beyond. Panellists almost universally felt that they would gain a 50% market share within the next 5 years. It's perhaps worth noting these questions were answered prior to the rather dramatic exit of some originator biologics in recent months, which I suspect has fast-tracked this to a large extent. Whilst a smaller percentage target, panellists agreed that by 2026, a quarter of all hospitals will supply medication via a non-traditional outpatient dispensing model in order to supply services closer to the patient's home. And a similar distribution of agreement was seen for the statement that half of our hospitals will have pharmacists working directly as part of the interdisciplinary team to navigate the growing complexity and access concerns. Picture a clinical pharmacist assisting with complex authority submissions in a CF or IBD clinic as part of their role. And this ties in neatly to the findings within theme 2 as described earlier by Russell. Next. So to the recommendations, the first is for pharmacy leaders to ensure procurement frameworks safeguard quality use of medicines and measure the value delivered from pharmacy resources. Whilst in some jurisdictions and hospitals, procurement and access program roles may already be reasonably established, the results suggest that there is a clear value and safety proposition for this to be recognised on a broader scale. And essentially, and in both cases, this is more involved than just navigating the process. And ultimately, upskilling a pharmacist in these spaces is generally of more value and a lot simpler than trying to teach a procurement or logistics expert the pharmacy game. The second was that leaders should actively participate in discussions around policies and funding reforms that increase medicines access and equity. In the forecast we highlight, this is crucial for future models to be fit for purpose and sustainable, whilst also remaining dynamic and agile. There's a great example and opportunity for this at the moment with the government's review of the efficient funding of chemotherapy, but these are rolling actions that we can take. For the final next recommendation, we suggest that it's our responsibility to lead the transition to biologicals and biosimilars, and that we can facilitate this via the development of clear education and management processes that retain the confidence of prescribers, dispensers, and our patients alike. As medicines experts, we must be able to set this ship on its course. And remember, the calm seas never make skilled sailors. And finally, and as a rather neat segue into Andrew's medication safety theme, we must retain a patient-first approach to how we deliver these complex medicines. Are there alternatives to having patients tied to our often inconvenient hospital outpatient dispensaries? Do we know what our patient preferences are, and are we listening to them? Are there financial business models that can support the development of a dedicated pharmacist clinic in the ambulatory care environment? So all thought-provoking, we hope, and I'll now pass you on to Andrew and theme 5.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the team who have presented before, and I'm sure you're about to see that while we have distinct themes, many of the aspects of that we've interrogated do have considerable overlap, and I'll touch on some of those as well. Now, medication safety was always going to be a major theme in this forecast, given the WHO Global Safety Patient Safety Challenge around medication without harm. And of course, here in Australia, the 10th National Health Priority Area being medication safety and quality. Of course, the SHPA has been leading this space for quite some time. And even yesterday, there was the Medication Safety Forum consortia that SHPA was involved in. So I had the great privilege to work with Tony Howe and also Dan Layla, two very insightful, very experienced pharmacists who brought some great dimensions to this. So in the next slide, we'll address some of the questions. So the first really looked around this role of leaders, and the question was that pharmacists are often very actively involved in the machinery of medication safety around committees and clinical leadership, but weren't necessarily the leader. And this question was really about saying that the pharmacists in the multidisciplinary team will be the lead. And you can see there was very strong support for that. And that fits nicely into some of the other themes talking about building leadership skills. Questions 2 and 3 got down to some nitty gritty about whether pharmacists will be actively involved in charting as people enter their episode of care and also as they transition out of that in discharge. And while pharmacists have been actively involved in these areas already, you can see that in question 2, people thought it was unlikely that pharmacists would be charting the medicines on reconciliation on entry into hospital. And of course, there was a bit more support for pharmacists having a very active role in charting the medicines related to their discharge, so discharge planning and summary. And I'm aware that Duncan gave a talk today, which I didn't get to see, but I got to see on Twitter, so I'm sure that sheds some light on it. So in the next slide, we've got the next few questions. Question 4 was about having access to deprescribing. Hospitals having a program for deprescribing. So you'll realise that deprescribing is an increasingly engaging movement, I'll call it, recognition, including in the WHO Patient Safety Challenge, that inappropriate polypharmacy is a major risk for preventable harm, and that laudable goal of reducing medication-related harm by 50% requires us to address that. And this question was saying that given the evidence and emerging impact of deprescribing, where will that sit in this environment? And you can see that most people are really lent towards the idea that we're not yet ready for deprescribing implementation, certainly in the hospital setting. Question 5 is really about making sure that there was access to the support needed, either directly in person or remote technology. And this was looking across the breadth of where pharmacy and medicines, pharmacy's practice and medicines are. So this looked at all settings, not just major centres and hospitals, but could we make sure that every episode of care was supported by pharmacists who had dedicated impact on medication safety and systems to improve quality. And you can see that there was certainly agreement that that is likely to be the case. In the last question, we went for one of those system blue sky questions. And you can see there was genuine equipoise about whether or not we would be able to have electronic systems. And here we're leading towards things like machine learning and AI that might be able to screen and use real-time data. In other themes, we've heard about the uptake, and we'll learn more about those again from how in the next theme, that electronic systems are increasingly being implemented. The idea would be to say, can we use evidence-based risk tools to translate information to identify people at high risk and, I suppose, better deploy our resources to prevent harm? And you could see that people agreed that, didn't agree that was a time will come just yet, but certainly some did. So we summarised the recommendations on the next slide. Really 3 simple ones. Again, it was about developing our workforce to make sure that they had those leadership skills to be the leaders in medication safety, and that is pharmacists leading the team. Workforce development around those vital roles for charting to make sure that we have a workforce ready to do that as that opportunity expands. And last of all, to make sure that we're building capacity in clinical informatics. So to see the uptake whether it's related to de-prescribing or algorithms to identify people at risk of harm. We do know it'll be a collaborative effort of pharmacists working in this clinical informatics area that'll make a difference. So with that, I'll hand over to Hao to pick up on the last thing.
Thanks very much for that. So before I start with the electronic revolution section, I just really wanted to thank our theme leads, Rosemary Burke and Peter Barclay, for all their hard work and expertise in this. So the title Electronic Revolution seems to speak for itself. As I'm sure you're aware, pharmacy operating without any type of computer system these days seems unimaginable. What is also unimaginable, or less difficult to imagine, is that what new technologies are going to be developed by 2026. But what we do know is that the future of medicine management systems should continue to support our patients and staff. Next, please. So the questions posed to the forecast panelists in this section focused on 6 areas, and 6 quite different areas. So the first question centered around specialised health informatics pharmacists. And as you can see, a majority of forecast panelists were very positive that hospitals will have one of these specialist pharmacists, and these pharmacists will have the desired skill set. And hopefully this will happen by 2026. As EMM rollout is underway across all of Australia, with some hospitals now having over a decade's worth of experience, the second question found a very large percentage of forecast panelists were very optimistic that at least half of all hospitals will have an electronic management system for a majority of the inpatient prescribing and administration of medicines. The third question posed to our forecast panelists in this section relates to automated dispensing cabinets, or ADCs, and their implementation. So only half of respondents believed that ADC implementation would occur in a quarter of all hospitals by 2026. So this kind of shows that we do have lots of room for improvement. Next, please. So when asked about the future of full closed loop medication management system implementation, respondents were not very positive compared to the other questions in this section. And it showed that they found that less than, or at least 10% of hospitals would have a full closed loop management system or achieve a HIM certification level 6 by 2026. This is really interesting to see because it looks like we all understand the challenges involved in this certification process, with only very few hospitals in Australia currently holding this certification level. So question 5 is in relation to telehealth consultations and virtual clinical pharmacy services. And as Ange mentioned, COVID has changed everything. So a majority of forecast panelists were very optimistic that at least 30% of hospitals will conduct telehealth pharmacy consultations and provide this virtual clinical pharmacy service as routine component of clinical service. The final question posed relates to successful integration of the My Health Records, or the MHR. So very large percentage, and as I said, it's 92% of forecast panelists were again very optimistic that 80% of hospitals will have successfully integrated the My Health Records into their own EMR system by 2026. Next, please. So combining the results of the survey and their expertise, the theme leads were able to provide some recommendations for the future. So firstly, it is recommended that we invest in training in digital technologies and solutions to address the workforce and health issues. This includes having the specialist informatics pharmacists with the necessary technical skills to improve health outcomes. Secondly, pharmacy leaders should actively follow developments in EMM systems and advocate for their adoption and expansion, keeping in mind the safety benefits, potential limitations, and to ensure user workflows meet the needs of their departments. And of course, it really needs to be individualised. The next recommendation is for pharmacy leaders to advocate in partnership with strong nursing leadership, so the CNIOs, for the implementation of automated dispensing cabinets to drive best practice in clinical workflows. The next recommendation, of which there are 6 in total. So recommendation number 4 is advocating for the implementation of closed loop medication management systems by pharmacy leaders. But really, again, this should be individualised as well. So one of the recommendations and expansions on this is
Sorry, Hal, I'll just let you know that, well, I certainly didn't catch the last 20 seconds.
Enabler of this is for the adoption of data matrix barcode. The fifth recommendation, I'll go back to the fourth recommendation. So the fourth recommendation was advocating for the implementation of closed loop medication management systems by our pharmacy leaders, but really it should be individualised. So a major enabler of this is the adoption of data matrix barcode standards for Australian pharmaceuticals mandated by the TGA. So hopefully you got that. The next recommendation is for pharmacy leaders to be aware of and increase the prevalence, safety and effectiveness of pharmacy telehealth services. So to ensure that this is viable and established funding pathway should be developed. Final recommendation is for pharmacy leaders to advocate for HMR, so My Health Record adoption by not only organisations, but by patients as well. And this is really to ensure accurate information sharing. So that's it for my part. I pass back to Tom.
Lovely, thank you, Hal, and other members of the advisory committee. So we're moving now to questions. So we have now a very brief amount of time to do a bit of an open discussion forum. So I'd ask those who joined us today, please unmute your microphones, turn back on your cameras, and either use the chat box or put your hand up using Zoom, or just start speaking if you have a question. Whilst we're waiting for questions, I'll just ask a question of Hal, who just spoke a moment ago. So I guess one of the things that you've highlighted there is the need to have specialist informatics pharmacists as a kind of a developing career in practice nationally. What skills do you think those pharmacists require, and how will we foster those skills?
So it looks like the skills for specialist pharmacists or informatic pharmacists will vary depending on the need of the organisation. But what we're really looking for and what we think hospital departments will be looking for are people who have really in-depth knowledge of the functionality of multiple different systems. And so they're able to extract the relevant data and to design strategies for system enhancements. So really all this is aimed for medication safety purposes. And while the informatics pharmacist is not the person who would actually go in and do the changes and make the physical changes, because of course they're left to the experts, they're able to understand the functionality that is available in order to, of course, again, to result in positive patient outcomes.
Excellent, thank you. And Hal, I'm not sure if you said it, James Grant from Queensland Health has also commented on the EMM stream around the map of digital sites and who's using what that's available through the link that he's put in the chat box. We have had, excellent. Sven Markson has asked, will this be officially published soon? So I think everyone who's in this room right now will be getting a copy later this afternoon, and Kristen will speak at the end around exactly how that's going to be launched more broadly. Galahad has asked how the perception of likelihood of future changes linked to the recommendations being put forward. Russell, I might put you on the spot with that one, if that's okay.
Sure, no problem, Tom. It's a good question because although the perception in some areas may, in some ways, perhaps lag behind initiatives that are happening around pharmacy sector. So the recommendations may sometimes suggest actions that people weren't expecting or not necessarily on their horizon. So it's meant to be about stimulating debate. So I guess when there's a discordance between the general perception and a recommendation, it's something that probably warrants further discussion amongst the clinicians and pharmacy leaders involved in that topic. So remember, it's meant to stimulate debate. And we've got the subject matter experts who've given their opinion based on what they know in literature, in government moves, that sort of thing, on the ground actions, and can hopefully provide some guidance that people can take up to address perceived or not perceived problems. So that makes sense.
Thanks, Russell. I guess, well, I'm just looking through the chat box. If I can ask another question again. So Russell, 7-day pharmacy services, expanded roles, not that challenging to roll out in metropolitan, but doable. What about the regional and rural settings? How do you see those being enabled over the next 5 years?
Yes, well, that's a good question, Tom. And I guess our survey reflects a bit of ambivalence around the feasibility or even negativity around that being possible in the next 5 years. And I think that's where some of the recommendations throughout the publication will come into play, where House and others have touched on telehealth as being a potential solution. Maybe that's the solution in those situations where there's just no one around to provide that service. The national standards will be the national standards though, so we need to comply with those. So telehealth might be a solution that's put forward for a number of recommendations to address that topic.
Thank you. And thanks, James, for just adding that commentary around skills needs in clinical informatics. Andrew, if I can, we have a question from Michael Ryan. Always better to ask other people's questions than mine. Michael, given the way it says, given the questions were framed around a likeliness scale, was there any analysis of the extent of positiveness from state to state or territory, which is an interesting one? If I can hand to Russell or Laura for that one.
I guess the short answer is no, there wasn't.
Oh,
but it would be interesting. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, look, it certainly would be interesting. And I think for future forecast, when we're doing it moving forward, I think we will look to broaden and expand even the forecast panelists surveyed in much bigger numbers, so that we can start to get some representation and draw some kind of assumptions from these particular representations of states. So we've got, big numbers to be able to break that down.
Excellent. Yes, it was certainly interesting to see that diversity of opinions. I know even in the theme that I was working on, which was around workforce, we asked the question around how likely is it that positions will have a surplus of appointable people, and certainly my experience, in Tasmania down the bottom of the country is we don't have a surplus, quite the reverse. We've got quite a workforce shortfall, and yet I hear from colleagues, particularly in Queensland, I think, saying we have a surplus of applicants for positions. So it will be interesting, I'm sure, over time to pick apart what the views are around all 36 of the questions that were asked state by state, because I'm sure there'll be some variation. If I can ask one more question while we wait for questions to come in, going to Andrew. So obviously a lot of the discussion around med safety was around having pharmacists taking on roles in charting and documenting on discharge. I guess I'd be interested in your views on what are the skills you think that we need to develop in our pharmacists over the next 5 years to 2026 to have our pharmacists doing discharge summaries, doing discharge medication lists, doing admission medications.
So I don't think there's too many skills we need to develop, to be honest, because we know that when the research has been done, pharmacists often do those skills in clinical trial settings or in trial setting. Pharmacists do those tasks better than most other healthcare professionals. So we do know that pharmacists are well placed to be doing it. And while in our recommendation, we did make it about building skills, probably the thing we really need to reflect on is how we make it happen. And one of the great joys of the forecasting strategy and stroking your chin, as academics like me do, is to look to the future. And part of the way that, we're encouraging the forecast panelists to look at these questions is to decide, is this a future reality? So I suppose that, first of all, green light, that this is a positive aspect going forward, likely to make a difference in medication safety. It is about then mapping out, using this as an impetus to say, so what do we need to make that happen? So I do think the skill set and training is there. This morning I was on another committee meeting around the guidance documents, the guiding principles for continuity of medication management and those things that are being revamped at the moment. So part of that is also embedding into each of those frameworks the role of the best healthcare professional providing, the right type of intervention to achieve the right outcome. And I suppose we're making a case that in this setting, a pharmacist is the best person to do that. So I suppose that's part of the broader picture.
Excellent, thank you. And if I can ask one final question, and if anyone has one more question, we have time for one more. Oh, excellent, we do. So we'll go to these questions finally, and then we'll wrap up and hand over to Kristen for the conclusion. So we've got a comment from Peter Barclay on the e-health topic, and from Halinder Singh, looking at variation in clinical informatics. So I might in a moment hand back around the clinical informatics theme. If I can just ask a question though, because I'm aware Peter Smart's got away without having a question asked of him. So Peter, you were looking at specialist supply and access and fund, complex issues around funding, and the need to drive additional resourcing so that pharmacists have a role in those processes. But obviously that's going to be a very resource intensive approach. What are other ways that pharmacy leaders could consider to make that more viable?
Thanks, Tom. Look, I think collaboration is a big aspect to that. I mean, we know that procurement resources, for example, could be spread across more than one hospital, across states potentially, and also that it can be substituted. So you could substitute people who are doing that job at the moment who don't have that skill set with pharmacists. That's about building the business case, I guess. Collaboration also and innovation with the community pharmacy sector in terms of getting patients access closer to home, but I think that ties in with the funding model changes that we anticipate and hope will come, and the red tape reduction. And then in the clinical service space, it's about understanding that sometimes the complexity component can be dealt with whilst the clinical pharmacist is managing other aspects of patient care. Ultimately, I think that the arguments for safety and value and financial arguments have built a fairly strong business case in their own right. If we do need extra resources, but I think there's a way of figuring it out in those, using those mechanisms.
Well answered, thank you, Peter. So look, I will wrap up a question there. Sorry, we do have one more from Linda Rains, but we might address that. In fact, I'm sure Matt might be interested in making contact with Linda externally to the session, who's asked the question about ADCs. So I would like now to start to wrap up this morning's session. So I'd like to thank our advisory committee members and like now to introduce. Sorry, first of all, I should like to say if you have any other questions for the project team, the project team, we're all happy to answer them directly. So if you'd like to send through any questions that we didn't have time for today, email them to Laura Opray, so that's LOPRAY @shpa.org.au. I'll conclude now and introduce SHPA CEO Kristen Michaels so that she can conclude the launch of Pharmacy Forecast Australia 2021.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for leaving me -1 minute to close everything off. But in all seriousness, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming along today, and thank you in particular to Tom for hosting everything, and to all of the advisory committee members for their presentations today, to Andrew, Peter, and Hal, to all of our theme leads and all of the forecast panelists. It has been a cast of thousands, and of course the scale has been big. Over 100 people have played a part or a role in the development and the execution of Pharmacy Forecast Australia. And of course, none of it would have been possible without the partnership and the friendship of our peers at the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. And I particularly want to thank Barbara, David, and Eric personally, given it's now after 10 p.m. on the east coast of the US. And I don't know about you, but for me on a school night, that's definitely after my bedtime. So thank you so much for staying with us tonight. We really, really genuinely appreciate it. The wisdom of crowds methodology that's led to the forecast has allowed us to create something that's truly unique in Australia, a future-focused document that reflects your experiences in hospitals across the country right now. And I just want to acknowledge the depth and the detail of the horizon, these views that have looked across to 2026. And Tom invited you at the start today to put this on your bedside tonight. And I don't want to draw your attention to what Tom might be doing of an evening, but I would invite you most definitely to take this document into your departments and into your executive meetings, and to put it onto your agendas, to use it in your day-to-day work, to use it in your business cases, to use it in your planning, to use it in your research, because it absolutely reflects not only what you are doing right now, but it should be useful to you in your day-to-day work and in your forecasting. So as a process and as an output, this forecast sits adjacent to what you are doing, but also to SHPA's advocacy activities and to our membership frameworks. And it's this distinction that's allowed the analysis and the recommendations of our theme leads to be distilled directly from leading hospital pharmacists and from our colleagues based on your current roles. Our 59 forecast panellists who responded to those 36 question surveys back in March covered all of the Australian jurisdictions, and they answered anonymously. So we really feel that there's a directness and an honesty in all of these statistics. And given that hospital pharmacists and technicians work embedded in medical teams, it's really important that this process has had a multidisciplinary flavour. And we're very, very appreciative of the contributions that the forecast has had from our our like-minded organisations, from the AMA, from the ADHA, from the Consumer Health Forum, from NPS Medicine Wise, from the Council of Pharmacy Schools, and from Medicines Australia. And finally, I really want to make special mention of our Pharmacy Forecast Advisory Committee Chair, Russell Levy, who I think Tom described at the start as a gentleman of pharmacy. He's had an absolutely tireless commitment to the project over the last 8 months. And we are, of course, in a virtual space today, but Russell, if you could just pretend that I am handing you a really, really nice bottle of vintage red right now, I would be very, very appreciative. And in addition, from us here in Victoria to you there in New South Wales, if we could, we'd like to give you the best advice we can, which is really get yourself some puzzles and, you know, maybe some sourdough starter and settle in, because it could be a long one. And of course that is a joke, but stay safe as well, because our thoughts are with you and with everyone else around the country right now. And for some closing housekeeping, I am pleased to advise that all attendees today at today's launch will receive a copy of Pharmacy Forecast Australia 2021 via email just after 1 p.m. Eastern Time today. Pharmacy Forecast Australia will be returning in 2022 with the support of Omnicell and the ASHP, and we look forward to ensuring that the forecast fulfills its mission as a conversation starter in Australian hospital pharmacy and healthcare planning. I encourage you to use the inaugural forecast actively and enthusiastically, and please do provide us with any feedback to the project team, to myself, of course, to anyone at SHPA. I thank you for joining us today from across the country. I wish you all a wonderful afternoon, and thank you.